Hello, my name is Reverend Dr. May Elise Cannon. Today is Thursday, November 30th, and it's day 55 since all this began on October 7th. Today is the seventh day of the temporary pause in fighting and the hostage exchange between Hamas and Israel. We're hoping and praying that this temporary pause would hold. It, of course, means that the bombing campaign on Gaza has stopped. It means that the violence from Hamas towards Israel has also ceased. So the agreement now is in 7 days. We initially heard from Netanyahu that initially he was open to a 10-day truce. The idea was that for every 10 Israeli hostages that were released, that there could be one additional day negotiated. Right now, my understanding is that the pauses are being extended 1 day at a time. So yesterday, they extended to today, and they just announced that they're now extending through tomorrow. So it's now Thursday. There will be an additional extension through Friday. According to the Associated Press, and this is just as of about an hour ago in the Gaza Strip, Israel and Hamas agreed to this ceasefire. They're calling it a ceasefire. We would call it a temporary pause. And the reason is they want to allow more hostages in addition to the prisoner exchanges of Palestinian prisoners to be released. So this is according to the Associated Press. Any further renewal of the truce now in its seventh day could prove to be more daunting because Hamas is expected to set a higher price for the remaining hostages. That's because most of the women and children have already been released. And so the remaining hostages are men or are military figures. Hamas has freed 2 Israeli women just this afternoon, Thursday afternoon. This is Middle East time. And more hostages are expected to follow, according to the Israeli military. And the goal would be, again, that today 10 Israeli hostages would be released. And the equivalent ratio has been about 1 to 3. For every Israeli hostage, 3 Palestinian prisoners would also be released. There has been increased international pressure for this truce to hold. And we at Churches for Middle East Peace, we're calling for a permanent ceasefire, for a negotiated settlement, for the end of violence. And the violence right now is spreading. So news from Jerusalem, Palestinian gunmen opened fire on people who were waiting for buses on the main highway entering into Jerusalem. 3 people were killed, several others were wounded. This is according to the Israeli police. The 2 attackers were brothers from a neighborhood in East Jerusalem. So according to the Palestinians, they are holding out for East Jerusalem to be the future capital of a Palestinian state. Many countries in the world see East Jerusalem as a part of the occupied Palestinian territories. Israel sees East Jerusalem as a part of annexed, as a part of Israel proper. But these 2 brothers were from East Jerusalem. They were killed after the attack. 6 other members of their family were detained. And the Israeli government ordered that the family's house be demolished. Hamas claimed responsibility for the attack, and they casted it as retaliation for the killing of women and children in Gaza and the occupied West Bank, and for Israel's other crimes. The attack, this is all still according to the Associated Press, the attack did not appear to threaten the truce in Gaza, but there is escalating violence in Jerusalem and the West Bank, including Israeli raids in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. And there's concern that it could blow back and cause a violation of the ceasefire. Even though the ceasefire is specific to Gaza and Hamas and Israel. On Wednesday, Israeli troops killed 2 Palestinian boys. According to the Palestinian health officials, one of them was 8 years old. And the Israeli military separately said that the raid killed 2 Islamic Jihad militants. We did hear also news that on the border around Gaza, that Israel reported that Hamas had violated the ceasefire, but they're continuing to negotiate. So there's no formal violation of the ceasefire, but Israel had reported that there were some soldiers that had been slightly injured in some skirmishes. We do know the total number of hostages so far that have been released have been more than 100 hostages. including Israelis and internationals. That's of the more than 240 hostages that are held. It's believed the majority now of the hostages that remain are men or are soldiers. So, the Israeli Defense Forces have said that they are prepared to continue fighting. And I think I talked about that in the last couple of days. We're continuing to hear that certainly the population in Israel does not want the goal of the government in terms of retaliation against Hamas to end, which would include also the bombing of Gaza. And so we're hearing that once this temporary pause is over, that the fighting would resume. And so we have significant concerns about that. Back in New York City, the last couple of days have been the day of solidarity with the Palestinian people on the 29th of November. I keep trying to check my dates because I don't know what day it is. But the day of solidarity with the Palestinian people is commemorated on November 29th. It has been annually since 1978. The date is significant because it's on November 29th in 1947 that the UN General Assembly adopted a resolution on the partition of Palestine. And so the 1948 year when the state of Israel was established for the Jewish people was considered a miracle. And for the Palestinian people, they call it the Nakba, or the Great Catastrophe. And many people today are saying that this is an extension of that this is, an ongoing catastrophe. So the UN Secretary General, has called Palestinian suffering in Gaza a humanitarian catastrophe and has committed the United Nations and UNRWA to remaining and being a beacon of hope amid despair and destruction. And he has stressed the urgent need for a genuine political resolution that meets the legitimate aspirations of Palestinian refugees. Blinken has been in Israel. I believe he's still there right now, but I know he's been there the last day or so. He's been working on an extended ceasefire. And what we're hearing from the United States government and what we're hearing from the Biden administration is that Israel's operations, as they continue, will operate with far greater precision. And so it's been reported that the U.S. supports Israel's right to defend itself, but the president hopes to influence military action by ensuring more targeted military action that avoids civilian casualties. The U.S. has warned Israel against moving their ground operations into South Gaza, where the majority of Palestinians are located who've been displaced. The U.S. has urged Israel against an assault on South Gaza that would, of course, cause greater civilian suffering. But news is still reporting that President Biden, is sticking to his belief that supporting Israel's cause gives him greater influence with its leaders and its public. I did read last night that the United States is considering the possibility of supporting a plan. I have not read this extensively, but this concerned me greatly, of the possibility of allowing Israel to move the refugees who have been displaced. 1.6, they're saying 80% of the population in Gaza has been displaced, and the majority of the population in the north moved south. And so there's conversation now about, would that population in the south be moved north so that Israel could continue its campaign against Hamas in the south, which would just be utterly devastating. The north, the infrastructure has been destroyed. It is dangerous because of the remnants of the chemicals from all of the bombing. There's no infrastructure. It's one of the things we heard very clearly from the Israeli military was one of the goals was the destruction of the infrastructure. And so how do you move a population group back and forth? I feel like it's absurd, from an ideological perspective, but from a humanitarian perspective, I don't even have words for it. We heard a message from the White House from Mr. Kirby, the spokesperson for the Security Council, who said, we're going to continue to urge our Israeli counterparts as they plan to go back to military operations to do what they can to be discreet, deliberate, careful, and cautious in every way possible. And our message to the White House and the US government is not good enough. Stop killing. Let's save lives. Let's preserve. Not only that, the more death there is, the more destruction there is, the more devastating this is for the reputation of Israel and the United States, not only amongst the Palestinians, not only in the Middle East, but in the whole world. And that violence is not the answer. And so we've talked about those choices before. We did just finish hosting a delegation the last couple of days of Palestinian Christians that have been in Washington, D.C. We pray that the seeds that they planted would be watered and would grow, and that more people would call for a ceasefire. We invite you to join us in calling for a ceasefire in our Advent prayer chains. Consider joining us in Washington, D.C. on December 11th, 6 p.m., the New York Avenue Presbyterian Church, a ceasefire Christmas service. We'll worship Jesus. We'll call for peace. There'll be an opportunity to have a prayer and protest walk afterward to the White House. And I just wanted to close with some words that we're using actually in the start of our Advent devotionals. I wrote these in June of this year, having no idea what was to come. This is what I wrote. I woke up almost every morning this past week and heard distressing news from Palestine and Israel. It's hard to not be discouraged. But in the midst of such news, we must remind ourselves that even when we cannot immediately see tangible results, our work continues to provide critical education, advocacy, and engagement in response to violence and oppression. We are motivated by our faith, not to give up hope, but to remain steadfast and diligent. I continue to say, despair is the luxury of the privileged. If our friends, colleagues, and partners in the Middle East continue to remain in situations of conflict, and as they continue to pursue peaceful responses to human rights violations and violence, who are we to give up hope? And in that regard, I have been so encouraged the past couple of days to be with friends from Jerusalem and from Bethlehem who are committed in the midst of not a conflict, but in the midst of death and violence and destruction. They have every reason to despair, and they are holding on to the belief that nonviolence is the only answer. And so might we follow their lead? Might we not despair, but be steadfast? Samud is the word in Arabic that means steadfastness, perseverance. And so we will not give up. We'll be steadfast in our pursuit of peace and in our pursuit of nonviolence and in our call for a ceasefire.